Welcome to the Investors Board Performance Review. I'm TK Kerstetter, the host of Inside America's Boardrooms, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We have a highlight show today that's going to take a look at the review series that we did, and we're holding this highlight show at the NASDAQ market site, and joining me is my partner in governance and a good friend. Let me introduce Paula Loop, who is the leader of PwC's Governance Insight Center. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you.
And the first thing I want to do is certainly thank PwC and NASDAQ and Equilar and Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich and Rosati, because without the support, we wouldn't have been able to do this fantastic series. So thank you for your support. Now, on with the highlights. For those that didn't get a chance to see the series yet, the Investor Board Performance Review invites institutional investors, proxy advisors, and influential activists to come and share their views about how they think boards are doing. Now, you must admit we had a pretty good crew this time.
You had a fantastic crew, I think. In the 3 sessions, we heard from the biggest investors around the globe, frankly. And if you think about it, you know, for an S&P 500 company, for example, a lot of those, for most of those companies, these were their biggest shareholders. So really interesting perspectives to hear what they had to say. I think even passive investors now are fundamentally focused on good governance. They think it's the way that you're going to drive the most shareholder value. So you're going to see more and more of this investor discussion around governance topics. I think they're going to be very engaged in the future.
Especially when you throw in proxy advisors, and we know the influence that they've certainly had.
Absolutely.
And then we're lucky enough to get 2 very interesting activists, one being Trian Partners, who just this past year had a interesting interaction with DuPont.
Yes, yes. And they had an interesting perspective. I won't give that away yet, but yes, they had some interesting perspective. So.
Okay, so let me just give a feel for the audience a feel for who we had. We had representatives from BlackRock, Vanguard, CalSTRS, New York City Pension Fund, ISS, Glass Lewis, Trian Partners, Spotlight Advisors, and the Council for Institutional Investors. A pretty good list.
A great list.
And all of them will have influence on what happens in the boardroom, so it's very good. So let's start, first of all, and we don't want to dwell on this first one very much, but let's first start taking a look at what boards thought, what the investors in this group thought that boards did well and that should be reinforced.
What we've seen in the last maybe 3 to 5 years is a much higher level of awareness amongst boards of their accountability to shareholders and the need to be accessible to shareholders. And I think that's been brought about in part by much wider adoption of annual elections and through more and more boards having experience, or board directors having experience of shareholder engagement and feeling the benefit of that. And underpinning that, I think you're just seeing increasing levels year on year of professionalism amongst the best directors. They really see that this is an important role where they need to be a perpetual student and engaged in the wider business community so that they can take that back inside the boardroom. Boards are in fact more independent and also act more independently than they used to. That's been a long-term progression. I think that's fairly uncontroversial assertion. Not to say that it's perfect, but I think there's been a significant change. I think boards are more attuned to shareholders than they had been. I would credit part of this to the whole say on pay vote, which started a new kind of discussion between shareholders and boards. Part of it's the rise of shareholder activism, which has made these issues more important to boards in a different way than they had been. That is the issue of maintaining good knowledge and connection with institutional shareholders. So I think that's improved. My sense is that boards are doing more that's better informed on strategy and capital allocation decisions. That's a little bit speculative on my part. I do think there's some evidence that M&A decisions, whether it's the boards or management, perhaps are a little better than they were, in that
for acquiring companies, the acquisitions have been value accretive in recent years, which in the whole history, acquisitions have tended to destroy value. So something seems to have changed there, at least temporarily. I think that boards are also doing better on executive succession planning, although again, that's hard to judge. And I would put that at the top of the list as areas for improvement as well.
Boards are definitely doing a better job of engaging with their shareholders. They know their shareholders and are engaging with them year-round. So I think they're able to prevent many of the surprise votes that would occur at annual meetings a decade ago. So I think they're better. I think they're more receptive to shareholder views than they were a decade ago as well.
Interesting. Okay, so what were your comments when you heard the panelists talk about what should be reinforced?
Yeah, I think what they reinforced were that directors are listening, right? Maybe not completely acting on everything they're hearing, but definitely that they're starting to listen. They're starting to hear more. And I think you could hear them point to different areas where directors have been responsive, either around capital allocation, around things like board composition. They still are looking for more, but they're definitely seeing that directors are very engaged in the process. And so I think that was a good sign, right? Good start.
Yeah, and if we would go back 10 years, certainly 20 years, but even 10 years, to see the change that has happened in the boardroom in those 10 years, it has been dramatic. Now, the panelists in the group are maybe not always satisfied with what happened, but there has been amazing progress in the change of how a director feels responsible for their duties, and I think they were in their way acknowledging that was the case.
Acknowledging that, and I think also commenting that at the bigger companies, they're seeing faster progress, and probably at some of the smaller companies. So, public companies, it's a wide array of a large number of companies that they have to deal with. So they're seeing some improvement, but as you said, they're not satisfied.
Yeah. So now we get to the meat of what this is, and that was when we posed the question, what should boards be aware of or improve on? And it seemed to break down, and this was interesting to me, it seemed to break down into 3 areas that for all the groups seemed to be the key focus that they wanted to talk about. The first and the largest was board composition. Mm-hmm. The second was shareholder engagement, no surprise to us.
Yeah.
And the third, which was a little bit of a surprise when you think of executive comp and all the things that they could have talked about, but the third that was stressed was strategy.
Yeah, just the fundamentals.
Yeah. So we're going to take a look, because those were such a main focus, we're going to take a look at their comments specifically in those 3 areas, and let's start with board composition.
I think the issue that trumps all others and that Sean alluded to is board quality and composition. Ken mentioned previously that boards are more independent, and I think that's true. And I think the focus from the investor perspective, certainly post-Enron, has been independence and accountability, and I think we still believe that's fundamental, but it's not sufficient. You have the right board, the right mix of skills, experience, sufficiently diverse, and so I think, and it's difficult as a very diversified investor to make those judgments, but looking at the board in totality, and you can have a board where it's possible that these are all highly qualified people capable of adding value in the boardroom, but maybe it's not the right board or no longer the right board for that company.
The boards I'm involved with, spending a lot of time and energy thinking about, do we have the right people in the boardroom? Do we have A players who are motivated, who have expertise that are going to help us navigate the competitive landscape? Are they independent from management? And it's our fiduciary responsibility to have A players in that room on behalf of the shareholders. So I think there's a lot of good things happening. There's still a lot of opportunity for improvement, however.
I'm going to go back to what we sort of started this conversation about, and it's really focusing on the composition of the boardroom and who's inside the boardroom. I've said recently that I think sometimes this pendulum of independence has gone almost too far, because I think now you have a board that oftentimes is, management captured, in that there's no one really inside the boardroom that knows those businesses and knows how that industry operates. And that's always concerning to me as an investor. And it sort of ties into this whole issue about tenure and people that may have worked in the industry, but they worked in the industry, 20, years ago. And so it's really looking at the construct of your board, making sure that not only do you have a diverse range of skill sets, but you make sure you have somebody in that boardroom, and at least 2 or 3 people in that boardroom that really know the business and knows how it operates, and not how it did 20 years ago. Because even, for example, like a consumer products company, you don't market like you used to, even 5, 10 years ago. I mean, with social media and everything that's going on, you really need someone that has current expertise in that business, and that can see it from a different perspective. And so I think that there are new risks that are posed to companies, but there's also a lot of new opportunities. And so just focusing on who's in that boardroom is just going to be so important going forward.
I think the number one issue in boardrooms today is board composition, is what I would describe. I think directors that are long tenured, no longer adding value, the business has moved in some direction where their expertise is no longer relevant, and yet they stick around. And it's a hard problem because, among other things, directors are in this somewhat enviable position that they get to set their own pay, and they get to renominate themselves, to an election that looks sort of like an election in a banana republic. There's only 6 people running for 6 seats. So the challenge is the sort of self-policing of composition. And I will tell you, as an activist investor and working with lots of activist investors, almost invariably, where you find a problem at a company or a company that's not performing well, you focus on the composition of the board, because the question is, why isn't there a self-correction mechanism going on here to fix the problems with management or the strategy or the capital structure or the collection of assets? What's missing? And often those companies have a mismatch in skill sets on the board, or tenures that are very extended, or people who are very dependent on the compensation sitting on the board, even though they don't add a tremendous amount of value or don't appear to be. So there's it's very rare that you find an activist investor identifying an underperforming company and then they say, oh my gosh, but it has a world-class, well-composed board, so never mind. Generally well-composed world-class boards don't end up in the crosshairs of activist investors, and they don't generally end up overseeing continuous underperformance or continuing problems of underperformance, because they help steer the company in the right direction. So the biggest problem, if you will, that I see at companies, it relates to composition of the board.
So Paula, there was a lot of issues here that sort of encompass board composition. Yes. We have diversity, we have age, we have tenure, we have board evaluations, and particularly sort of the skill and the quality of directors. Almost every investor or proxy advisor had views about this, and we're going to push the agenda for board composition. And is that the same thing you're seeing when you're out?
Absolutely, and I think what we heard from them and what I hear when I'm out talking to boards as well and other investors is just that succession planning is really at the heart of the whole thing, right? So it sounds like it's going to be easy enough. You've got, let's just say on average, 10 people, and you want to get a nice board together, and you want to have diversity of skills and backgrounds and all this. But it's a lot harder. The devil's in the details there. It's a lot harder to put the skills that you think you need on that board, not only for the company today, but for the company into the future. To lay that out with the right timing, you want some new directors, you want some midterm directors, and you want some more experienced directors on the board. So you've got to juggle all those pieces. It's quite a complicated puzzle. And then at the end of the day, you have to remember too that sometimes you need to move some people along, right? You might have a board member that's not contributing at the highest level that you would want today, or you need to change it up because you need a different skill or what have you. And we have to figure out ways to move some of those directors on to other boards or to other activities. So it's a lot more complicated than it seems, and I think it's right to get a lot of attention.
Well, and your research, annual research, shows each year that there is a pretty good subset, almost 35 to 40% annually, that say that those directors should be replaced. So I'll tell you what's interesting that I took out of it. Audit the audit committee had its chance in the hot seat. Obviously, it's been the compensation committee that's
Yep.
had its chance. I actually think that what we're going to see is
Nom-gov.
Nom-gov in the
Right.
hot seat. So the one that's always been the sort of the stepchild and that
Yep.
everybody thought was easy is not going to be so easy anymore.
Yep.
And one of the trends I can tell you is going to happen is they're going to have to be paid more equal. The
Oh,
chair of
that-
that committee is going to have to be paid more
That's
equal
probably
going
true.
forward.
Yep.
So let me introduce the next section, and this is something that shouldn't come to a surprise to anybody, and that's the shareholder engagement. And the value of this for us was we had people that actually explained how they wanted boards to engage. And I think that's going to be particularly valuable to a lot of boards who have asked questions, even of us, is how do we engage and how do you figure that out? So let's take a look at what they had to say about engagement.
It's important to note there are really two kinds of engagement in that high-touch space. There's what I would consider the command performance engagement, where we have a very specific issue or concern with compensation or governance or a transaction, something like that, where we, there's an issue in play over which the board has exclusive purview, right? We want to talk to the board. We want to talk to the chair of the comp committee about the CEO's comp. We don't want to talk to the CEO about his or her own compensation. Or we want to talk to the board about the process they undertook to evaluate a transaction. So those are the instances where we really demand, if you will, engagement with the board. More broadly, though, over time, we want to incorporate the board perspective and our ability to convey to the board our perspective on a much broader range of issues. So, in much the same way that companies' disclosures to share owners form a foundation for that, our broader outreach to companies through letters from our chairman and CEO on particular issues, I think starts to set that stage. But over time, we actually do want to meet with just about everybody. And we're managing that, and a big piece of that is timing matters, right? During the proxy season is not an ideal time for us to have one of those relationship building discussions. But now that we're on the downside of the proxy season, at least in the US, our one-on-one engagement with companies on a more relationship building basis is really going to pick up. And that's a really important part of our process for both informing ourselves on the specifics at individual companies, but also understanding the range of practice and using those discussions with companies to drive best practice more broadly across the portfolio.
I think it's important, for us to be open to engaging. So we engage with any company who requests it. And, some companies say, well, we want to come meet with you in person. And I try to, let them know that an in-person meeting isn't necessary for every single meeting, to try to be respectful of their time, because if it's something that we don't really have any major concerns or issues with the company, to have someone fly to San Francisco just to meet with us may not be the best use of that company's time, particularly if they're bringing directors. However, since there's BlackRock and other firms in that city, if they're already in the city, then we're happy to do that. So that's one big part of it. You don't necessarily need an in-person meeting with us. We're very happy to do it over the phone. That can be very efficient. And I think the best engagements we've had is where there is an expectation about what the issues are going to be about a week ahead of time, so I can ensure I have the right analyst to join me in that engagement, whether it's compensation, E&S, pure, more straight governance, say board succession, that sort of thing. Maybe a slide deck that is no more than 8 to 10 slides, not that we flip through it, but that it's a leave behind. So when we go to write the report on the company, we have that as a reference tool. If I've had some companies start with a full IR deck that's 60, 70 pages long, and they just kind of flip through it, and it's less of a constructive dialogue, it's more of just a presentation to us, and this doesn't really give us the opportunity to really ask questions, or frankly for the company to ask questions of us. The better engagements I've seen are with maybe 1 or 2 directors and 1 or 2 executives without a consultant, just having a more even casual type dialogue that's pretty frank. And we benefit greatly from it because we're learning a lot about a particular company. In some companies, we've not displayed our pay performance analysis because of a good discussion about why their peers just don't make sense at all, or we've made significant changes over the years to our peer group methodology that we use, that we partner with Equilar, because of good constructive feedback from companies. So we find it really, really is helpful. But the least helpful ones are where there's, 6 to 7 people, all executives, and they constantly turn to the external comp consultant to ask them a question about how their own compensation program works, which raises a host of questions about, geez, if they don't even know how their own comp program works, how do they know if they're being incentivized under it? So I think this sort of ranges there. But I think, a little bit of heads up of what they want to talk about, not sticking to, a very detailed presentation, but more an opportunity for dialogue and learning, I think is the ideal situation.
From our perspective, we want to engage with the director when there's something substantive to discuss. And by substantive, I mean when you go into the meeting with an expectation of what you're going to come away from that meeting with. And we are happy to meet with directors, particularly new directors, say a new lead independent director, if the board or the company wants to make sure that we know who that person is and that that director has a sense of our policies, our approach, the way we think about governance and leadership and so on. But we don't want to meet just so you can meet some statistics on how often you've met with your major shareholders. And that's true of management as well as of directors. We truly appreciate that directors have other things to do with their spare time or with their time. And so we want those kind of meetings to be focused. We're very happy to meet when the company requests the meeting, again, if there's an agenda and we know what the purpose of the meeting is. And we fully expect that when we ask for one, the company appreciates that we have an agenda and that we are expecting to get something out of it. And in terms of that outcome, it could be just building mutual understanding. As you said, we want to have a better sense of how the board operates, because from the outside it's looking a little dysfunctional. It could be that we're actually seeking change and that we want to explain that privately so that the board is fully aware of our position and can take its decisions fully informed.
I've heard a lot from directors or companies that want to bring a director to talk to CalSTRS. And at this moment in time, we are accepting all of those meetings, but we feel like we have an obligation, one, to appropriately staff those meetings, to be very prepared when those companies come in to meet with us. And I've heard several times from directors that they feel like this is part of their job now. And I'm with Michelle, though. It doesn't need to be every year. It doesn't need to be, these are very successful, very accomplished people that a lot of times have other full-time jobs. So I understand wanting to get to know your shareholders and wanting to hear directly from them, and I think it's important to build that relationship, but it doesn't need to be every year, and it doesn't need to be, like you said, just to come and meet us. We're happy to do things by phone and conference calls, and I think you can get a lot from those, but I'm with Michelle also in the sense that, in turn, though, when we ask for a meeting, it's generally because we have a specific issue that's a board-level issue. These are things like executive compensation or proxy access or the leadership at the company. We see, directors as our representatives in the boardroom, and when we have an issue that's board level, we expect to meet with the director.
There's a lot of nervousness still about directors meeting with investors. I think it's pretty clear from companies that have done this well that you can do it in a way that does not raise FD concerns. That's pretty straightforward. I've worked with a good number of directors who have been surprised that they got more insight out of it than they expected, and it was easier than they expected. But I think most boards are struggling with it.
Engagement is on the rise, director shareholder engagement. More and more, we do have a willingness from companies to put forward directors, and directors more and more are running that meeting. They're not, we've had times when, you have 5 people from management and the director, and it's unclear which is the director and which is management. And we see that changing. We sometimes have meetings where it's just an independent director, which is which is very different.
No big surprise in the sense of how investors and proxy advisors feel about engagement, but fascinating thoughts about and advice to boards on what to do, and that, don't just plan a meeting to plan a meeting, but the thing that was particularly interesting to me was that don't send the camera-ready guy to everything.
Or only the camera-ready
only
guy.
camera-ready guy.
Yeah.
They don't want. They'd rather have the head of the audit committee or the head of the comp committee, even though they may not be polished. That's more significant
Yep.
in the meeting. So, what was your take from what you saw?
Engagement is such an interesting topic to me. When I talk to CEOs, there's a fair number of CEOs that are fairly hesitant about sending their directors to talk to investors, and there's a lot of directors that are also reticent about having these conversations. So I think, again, what we're still hearing is that investors want to have this discussion. They want to have it with the right person, to your point. But I do think there's work that has to be done on both sides. I'm not necessarily sure, based on the research that PwC has done, whether or not the investors are always prepared for the engagement and whether or not the directors are prepared as well. So I think both of them need to do a little work to come together a little bit better, make sure the topics are crisp, the agenda is right, and it takes work to get that agenda, I think, planned out in advance. And then really focus on the issues. And at the end of the day, the real thing directors should be getting out of this is listening. It really shouldn't be, they shouldn't be terribly worried about what they're saying, much more worried about getting feedback, bringing back that information back to the boardroom, and then being able to process it and act on it if they needed to.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and it's going to be interesting to see. At its core, and I'm a pro-business guy and have been accused that on this show, but at its core, the fact that investors can't talk to who is representing them in the boardroom just doesn't make logical sense.
It doesn't sit well.
Right.
Yep.
So if this is who's representing you, and particularly if you're a 5% holder like some of our panelists were, that's just not a out of the realm request to do.
It doesn't seem like it.
Somehow we're going to have to keep moving in that direction because it just seems to make sense.
Yep, I agree with you.
So our next topic was strategy. And strategy, again, was one that it might not have surprised you, but it surprised me a little bit only because of the other choices that I thought that they could have talked about. So let's just see what they had to say about strategy.
One area where I think nearly every company needs to improve, and it's largely the responsibility of the board, but clearly working very closely with management, is articulating the company's long-term strategy, and long-term way out past 3 years, but 3, 5, 10, and the milestones against which the company should be assessed. So many companies say, oh, our shareholders don't understand us. Well, whose fault is that? If you're not telling us what you're doing and how you should be measured against those goals, then it's quite likely that we will be misunderstanding what you're trying to do and holding you accountable to the wrong things. And our CEO, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, wrote to a large number of the companies in which we're a major holder, asking for this and asking for the board to be directly involved.
I think boards are going to face the question, where is the growth going to come from in the coming years? I think shareholders are certainly looking they're looking very closely at strategy. They have higher expectations of directors to be able to comment on company strategy. And I fully expect that there will be more conversations around where companies are going to find growth going forward. And the answer will likely be different than it was in the trailing 10 or 20 years. The answer will not always be an acquisition. Investors are very sophisticated. They tend to follow industries very closely and companies very closely. They'll expect boards to be able to comment on what the company is doing to deliver sustainable growth for long-term investors.
Interesting. And let me hear your comments first.
Yeah, so a strategy, it was an interesting topic to choose from, but I think it makes a lot of sense. First of all, I think when investors and activist investors and others think about directors, that's one of the most important jobs that a director does, is oversee the company's strategy. So I'm not surprised that they brought it up. I think there's different things that should be discussed around that. So one of the things that I wanted to hear more about also was the ESG and sustainability, and the way to deliver those messages is really through strategy. And you don't hear a lot about that. Companies aren't really thinking about it that way. Investors are still struggling on how to process ESG and sustainability information as well. So embedding that into that strategy discussion, I think, would be a really good thing to be doing going forward. And I do think that some of the more sophisticated investors are going to start to look for that. So that's one component. And then I think when you talk to the activist investors, one of their big pushes was really, are you thinking outside of the box related to strategy? Are you really pushing back on management? Are you really forming your own view and really, making sure you exercise those judgments in the boardroom? So that was probably not surprising, but you knew that was going to come out from an activist conversation.
When I sat on a public board, the issue of strategy to me was very close to the vest. Okay, it wasn't something that you went out and
the competitors.
Right,
Yeah.
you didn't share any advantage at all to the competitors. Now, when I see how passionate BlackRock and others are about communicating about strategy, there has to be a fine line there of what you can say about direction of the company, whatever, and yet not be putting your game plan out into
Too much out there.
Too
right.
much out there. But this was not something that they were willing to compromise on.
No,
They want to
no.
understand more about strategy, and as we saw with all the things that could be talked about, that was one of them that
Absolutely.
came up.
I think there's a lot more that will be done there, and I do think that this sustainability element will start to really blend into that
Yeah.
as well. So there'll be more to come in that topic.
So lastly, we asked them about trends in the future, and we didn't get as much, probably because our time was running out, but we didn't get as much, but we did get something that was very interesting, particularly by Ed Garden, who's the Chief Investment Officer at Trian. So let's see what he had to say, and this I think is really sort of eye-opening. Let's run that.
I'm on the board of Bank of New York Mellon, and Bank of New York Mellon did something I think very smart. Their idea, which was we created a finance committee, and the finance committee, which I'm on, is made up of a few directors who will really take the lead on asking for this type of material, and on behalf of the board, sort of dig in on some of the operational issues that I'm describing. I really think the idea of a finance committee and allowing a smaller group of the directors offline, right, off cycle, really dig into some of the issues and make sure they understand on behalf of the board what exactly is happening operationally is a really elegant way to do it.
So Paula, what was your take when you heard Ed's comments relative to the being involved more in operations and the PE model?
Yeah, thinking of it more as a PE model. I'm not terribly surprised because, again, when you think about the activists, this is a little bit of what they've been doing as well, right? And if you ever talk to board members that have had an activist on their board, they go deep. They have typically people behind them that help them go deep, so resources that they can tap into, whether they're analysts, whether they're people that focus on operations, that can give them more input on competitive edge, all sorts of different things that they bring to the board discussion. And that's really where an activist on the board, I think, differentiates themselves from other board members. So I'm not surprised that Trian would think a little bit more about that PE model and whether or not you really can get deeper into the operations and focusing more on how the business is running and what it's doing.
Well, I think he, raised a fair question during the course of his being a panelist here, and that, he posed the question to the audience: why does everybody do better in spin-offs and taking companies private when the whole theory of getting it under the corporate umbrella was you have all these resources that'll help it be successful, but for whatever reason, his point is it loses that focus, and with the spin out or the taking it private, people become more involved, emotionally, and it ends up being more successful. So I think the question to senior leadership of larger organizations is how can you create that model that won't let that will let these companies thrive as much under the big umbrella as they would if they were spun off.
On a separate umbrella. Yeah. Yeah.
So that concludes our highlights. Again, I want to thank you for participating and the rest of the sponsors. It was really great. If anybody out there has not seen this, you can either Google Investors Board Performance Review, or you can go into the Inside America's Boardroom site and get a chance to see these in its totality. But we want to thank all the panelists and all the sponsors and even our live audiences. If you would like to be a live audience member in the future, just watch. We'll be giving out notices, and we hopefully will have some more interesting things to come along these same lines. So
I think you will.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to be void of interesting topics going forward.
And I look forward, again, thank you for all your comments in this, and we just look forward to, again, bringing this information to you, the board members. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.